you. Johnny, and of course you have your own experience in the same thing.
Yeah, I would just ask each of you individually. I mean, the moral case, which you've been talking about a lot this morning, is very, very clear. Right? It's been picked up by people in this country, and there's some very reasonable men and women, like Lord Richards, who are pretty outraged by the way the government is treating these people. Just briefly to you, where is the breakdown point in this? Because we see the Ministry of Defence and others say we're doing all this, okay, but the reality we see is very different. Is it the Home Office, for example? And what can we do to change the situation? First to you, Sarah.
It's a big question. Yeah, so let me say one thing still about the moral case. I agree the moral case is very strong, and at the same time I think, also having those asylum schemes in mind, I think we also have to think about just simply needs, right? I mean, So even if somebody was the breadwinner in the family and originally took the job because they needed the money, I still think that once that person's life is under threat...
the case is very clear. The case of doing it is very clear.
That's right, but so where's the breakdown? I think there must be some political reluctance somewhere, because it's very interesting that this has very strong public support, as you say. I think the Home Office, it's difficult for me to point exactly where it is. I mean, I think the Home Office, in relation to the asylum claims I would say that there's some problem with the Home Office assessment, because we have seen that a lot of appeal cases went through. And so there seems to be something wrong with the initial assessment of those claims. I also think that one of the major breakdowns is the very tight eligibility criteria. So the fact that if somebody worked for 7 years for the Brits prior to 2012 and perhaps also ceased their employment because they already felt under threat, let's say in 2010, they wouldn't be eligible under those criteria. I think the other breakdown, the other point of breakdown is the preference for the internal relocation, where I'm not always sure if this is feasible for the reasons that Tom mentioned.
Yeah. Okay.
And can I say a final thing? I think it's really important that we look at this in two different phases. I mean, one is really the immediate protection, so that could be international relocation, but I think we shouldn't forget these people once they have arrived in the UK. So I would also say that there's some problem of breakdown. I mean, I speak to people from local authorities who are extremely willing to support this group, also again for the reasons that you mentioned. But there's no exchange of best practices among local authorities. There's no organization really to support different local authorities with the specific needs that this particular group might face.
Okay. And to you, Tom.
So as you know, the first thing is that it's pinning down any location in government is extremely difficult. And so, I mean, the problem that I've come across is that the database isn't there, as it were. There isn't a list of everybody who worked for us in certain capacities and are graduated. Well, this person did more than that, and so on. And that makes it very difficult. You then get into the Home Office, where it's quite reasonably what they're trying to do is to make sure that they assess each situation and respond accordingly. But you're dealing with people who have, of course, fled very often overland from Afghanistan and come all the way to Dover, or indeed flown in, and are deeply suspicious of saying who they are and what they are, because they're still extremely concerned for their safety. So you don't always get the immediate answer first, the fullest answer first, and therefore we have a problem there. I think that this is a cross-government responsibility, frankly. I don't see how it sits solely in the MOD, because the MOD's job, as you know better than anyone, is to prepare people for operational service overseas and to make sure we fight our nation's battles and win them. This, on the return element, is actually much more looking after people in the UK. And that's where I would argue that the MOD's job is to make sure that...
So it's a classic case, really, of the government institutions, which really should be drawn together by the Cabinet Office, not working for each other for the benefit of the individual. And I think, Chair, if I may, it might be really worth getting the Home Office Minister or one of the Cabinet Ministers in because the moral case on this is so strong across the nation as well. It's just not good enough that we can treat people in this manner.
I can speak about an interpreter who worked with me very closely, who I'm very pleased to say did secure asylum in the United Kingdom, and as I said, will, I hope, be staying here, and nobody deserves his citizenship more than he does. But he's now living, I won't say where, I won't give his name for obvious reasons, he feels nervous even in the UK. He is now living in a relatively isolated, in his terms, community in the Midlands, relatively distant from other Afghans, with no job, and has had no job for a while. I mean, he's being supported financially, so on that grounds, of course, he's fine. But this is a fit, intelligent young man with a wife and 2 small children, and he just wants to work. Now, a few of us are helping out in various ways, and he should, I hope very much, he should be okay shortly. But how many others are there who don't have the level of help that he will require?
And it's a national responsibility.
And it's a national responsibility.
Colonialism, in a way, that these people helped us in these operations, and I think we should really drive that home.
Johnny?
Yeah, Lord Stewart, how long were you Chief Defence Staff for until 2010?
4.5 years.
4.5 years. So this is right during your period. What did you do to help these people? Why didn't you sort this out at the time?
Well, first of all, of course, we must bear in mind that up until the end of 2010, which is the period that I can answer for, we weren't planning to leave Afghanistan.
Whatever.
Well, not for the long term. At that stage, the UK's policy was to remain committed militarily as well as financially and politically to Afghanistan for the long haul. That's what we were telling the Afghans, and that's what we were telling the Pakistanis. So at that stage, there was no requirement for a redundancy scheme, and nor was there, frankly, a requirement for an intimidation scheme, because these people were still working for us and still being under the protection of British forces. So in terms of relocation, in terms of intimidation, and in terms of redundancy, that was all post-2010. I mean, what I would say is that we had not done enough thinking about locally employed civilians, the context in which they're employed, and the long term for them in general. I listened with interest to your previous witnesses, one of whom I think suggested that there should be some scheme thought up in advance. I actually think that's impractical, because you heard from your other witness the evolutionary process that we went through in hiring these civilians. There was no sort of set plan in advance, and all members of this committee, I suspect, know that no plan survives first contact with the enemy anyway. But what we do need, I think, is a much more coherent, locally employed civilian element within our overall command structure that pays attention to them and to their needs as they evolve and as they develop, as a campaign evolves and develops, and that is responsive to that. So I think the notion of having a grand plan at the outset simply won't work, but having a part of the organisation that responds to circumstances and develops responses to those evolutions coherently is extremely important. And if I were to ask the MOD currently anything about the future plans for locally employed civilians, and here I stray into a little bit of hearsay, I understand that in future the intent is for them to be employed at arm's length, in other words, to have a contractor that is responsible for hiring all of those civilians. Well, there are advantages to that, but there are also disadvantages. And if we think that by employing them at arm's length we are removing ourselves from the moral obligation to them, I'm afraid we've got it wrong. Yeah, and the reputational risk will still be ours. So I would want to probe that, in some detail.
So in your experience, and clearly you've got heavily involved in this since, and you've got an oversight into this now, where do you think the point of failure is with this? Because you've got the great British public, you've got politicians in this place trying to do the right thing, we have a clear moral responsibility to these people. Why is it not happening?
My own view, and it's obviously just a personal view, is that it is the demarcations between different parts of government. Home Office on one hand, Foreign Office on another, MOD on the other. We all know how difficult it is to get those elements working together coherently. I think MOD and the Foreign Office, and to some extent DFID, have in recent years started to tackle some of those problems. But I think with the Home Office, it's a different matter. So it's a question of getting a coherent whole-of-government response that responds to all of the needs. The Home Office's pressures clearly are very different from those of the MOD.
But forgive me, is that not what the Cabinet Office is for?
Well, you'd have to ask someone from the Cabinet Office about that, but is it what the Cabinet Office should be for? Then my answer would be yes.
Okay. And can I just ask the same question to you, please, Baroness Cummins? What do you think is the single point of failure? Is it that inability to draw all these things together? Is it a lack of political will to answer this question? What is it?
Well, I think up to fairly recently, the policies hadn't been being applied as generously or as flexibly as they could be, because we do have a good redundancy scheme, and we're the only coalition country that has anything like the intimidation policy. Yeah. So we've got the groundwork there, which is very reprehensible, but which is very very good. But I don't think that the MOD has been doing a very good job in communicating what it already does. And so people have got the wrong end of the stick. I mean, there's been a lot of press coverage, for example, saying we haven't let a single interpreter into this country, when they're clearly only obviously talking about the intimidation policy and ignoring the hundreds who've come in under the redundancy scheme. So I think the communication of what we're already doing has been poor, and I think in the Assurance Committee that Lord Stirrup and I now sit on, we've seen increasingly a more generous and flexible approach to applying the intimidation policy.
So what you're saying there is they are listening to what you're saying, right? And they are. There is change coming about because of the input you're having into this.
I think slowly. I think that the committee is in very early stages. We haven't met very often. We're currently, Lord Stirrup and I are taking advice from the National Audit Office on what an acceptable level of scrutiny should look like. How many cases should we be looking at to make our role credible?
And have you got an example of policy change in response to concerns, directly in response to concerns you've made?
Yes, I mean, for example, we've requested clarification of wording in the operational guidance in one or two cases. There was a mismatch in the wording. One document said that they needed to prove a direct link with their employment with UK forces, and another said there should be it should be a clear result of, things like that.
So it is working.
Yes.
Do you think there was a lack of oversight before that committee was set up?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. They did commission an independent barrister to scrutinise a sample of cases before we were set up.
Right. What do you think, Lord Stirrup? Do you think there was a lack of oversight before?
I think there was no external oversight set up. They sought independent advice on a variety of issues. But this committee was the first bit of external oversight. But I would just re-emphasise what Baroness Cousins has said. We've not seen a statistically significant sample yet, and so we've got more work to do. But within the small sample that I have seen, I would say that the government's policy, and you can talk about the policy separately, but the government's policy is being applied effectively. And one encouraging sign, I would say, is that one case that I have seen, the evidence, and it isn't just written evidence, it's evidence from the family, it's institutional, is, to use a technical term, a bit iffy. But the MOD erred on the side of generosity rather than suspicion, which is exactly what we would wish them to do.
Very helpful. Thank you very much.